You know, when you work for Stanley, he's not going to stop until it's exactly the way he wants it, right, wrong, or indifferent.
How many films did Stanley make in his lifetime? Very few. He took a long, long time between the films. He was obsessed with those films.
He wanted to take us places we could never have imagined, and so he imagined them for us. He is Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick is often remembered by his great directorial efforts in movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, amongst others. But today we're going to see what he left behind in the form of unfinished movies and scripts. So let's start with his most famous unfinished movie, Napoleon. In the late 60s, after the success of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick was given more or less free realm to do whatever he wanted for his next movie. And while he had many interests over the course of his life, there was a figure whom he had always had a fascination for: French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. And in proper Kubrick fashion, he began an enterprise of effort reuniting all the information he could find on the emperor. From sending teams to gather documents, several artifacts, and buying books in multiple languages, Kubrick famously had a filing cabinet filled with cards that each traced every day of Napoleon's life. In fact, the director was so quote-unquote obsessed in his compiling of information that he tasked someone to bring a sample of the soil from places that had once been stages of important battlefields during Napoleon's life, so he could replicate the same exact color and texture of it.
He sent off Andrew Burke and his assistant to Paris to find actual artifacts of Napoleon.
And when he talked about the movie and some of the scenes he envisioned, particularly great battle scenes, he expressed that his plans were for these to be choreographed like ballets. He had this vision in his mind of choreographing violence, which makes sense, as he once said, quote, "A film is or should be more like music than fiction. It should be a progression of moods and feelings. The theme, what's behind the emotion, the meaning, all that comes later." But contrary to popular belief, violence in crafted battle scenes weren't his main point of interest. It was usually what Napoleon did the night before, and that was paperwork. And this can be perceived in the script he left behind, which revolves a great deal around Napoleon's early days in Paris and his love affairs. Yet despite years and years of pre-production, casting Jack Nicholson as Napoleon himself, and conversations with Audrey Hepburn to play Josephine, despite the extensive location scouting in France, the UK, and Romania, where famously the People's Army had committed more than 50,000 bodies to the movie, despite coming up with ingenious ideas such as the design of paper costumes for thousands of extras standing in the background of battle scenes, and camera testing it all, the movie ultimately didn't go ahead. Why? Well, for a myriad of small reasons. First, the pre-production process essentially took too long, and in the midst of such complex tasks and all this research, several movies with similar themes and backgrounds were released in the 70s, particularly the adaptation of War and Peace and Waterloo. And Waterloo, in particular, really impacted this production because it didn't perform as expected, and MGM, fearing the same could happen with Napoleon, which was already predicted to have very high production costs, pulled it. And while Kubrick retained the rights to develop the film, experts in the unfinished Kubrick documentary point to the fact that even if he gave the script he had to another studio to produce it, or tried to write another script surrounding Napoleon, MGM could pursue legal action for the infringement of their rights over the story.
Then the question, of course, arose, well, why didn't Stanley just do it? It's public domain, for Christ's sakes. It's Napoleon, so MGM can't own Napoleon. But he could never do it again because if he tried to do it at Warner's, for example, MGM would come after Warner's and Stanley and say, hey, wait a minute. you're infringing upon our story. And we say, no, this is another screenplay that Stanley wrote. And they'd say, yeah, but Napoleon's Napoleon. You can't get the guy to do it twice. And there would be no way, because his concept was so brilliant and so much a part of his enthusiasm for doing it, that he could not do another version that would be satisfactory to him. So it just languished there.
However, not all was lost. Much of the historical research Kubrick made would help and influence him in the production of Barry Lyndon. And just last year, Steven Spielberg announced that he is developing a miniseries on Napoleon based on the script Kubrick left behind.
We're mounting a large production for HBO based on Stanley's original script, Napoleon. So we are working on Napoleon as a 7-part limited series.
After completing Barry Lyndon, Kubrick turned his focus to a subject that had long been of his interest, and that was World War II and the Holocaust. His interest in exploring these horrific events actually brings parallels to A Clockwork Orange, in the sense that there's an exploration of the irrational in society and the capacity of humans for savage behavior. So Kubrick looked around for a book about this subject matter and found a great basis to start with in a book written by Louis Begley titled Wartime Lies. And the title of this movie, Aryan Papers, was actually based on the need for people at the time to justify basically their existence through papers that prove their Aryan heritage and therefore their purity according to the Nazi ideology. The Aryan Papers revolved around a young boy and his aunt who tried to survive in occupied Poland during World War II, which brings to light a common theme in Kubrick's movies: the focus on people in extreme situations, the behavior of humans, shall we say, when pushed to an extreme. And examples of this can be found in other movies he directed, such as Full Metal Jacket, The Shining, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. He went as far as casting Joseph Mazzello as the boy and the Dutch actress Johanna T. Stege after allegedly being turned down by Julia Roberts and Uma Thurman. In his words about his original intention for the script, Kubrick wrote that he wanted, quote, a dramatic structure that compressed the complex and vast information into the story of an individual who represented the essence of this man-made hell. Ultimately, the movie would end up being shelved, also due to several reasons. First, due to the release of Schindler's List, which in itself had a similar topic, and due to this, both Warner Brothers and the director ultimately decided not to go ahead, as issues had risen previously during the making of Full Metal Jacket due to the fact that a similar movie was being made, and ahead of them, which was Oliver Stone's Platoon. According to Kubrick's wife, the depressing nature of the themes he wanted to explore associated with the lengthy production and deep research was also a reason that drove Kubrick away from the project itself as it began to affect him. And so he returned his attention to another movie concept that he had been developing since the early 70s. And you're going to be surprised at this one. The movie was AI, artificial intelligence. Now, when it comes to AI, there's records of Kubrick starting to develop this movie in the early 1970s after he purchased the rights to Brian Aldiss's sci-fi short story titled Super Toys Last All Summer Long. However, if the movie was only completed by another director, which in essence makes it a different movie in 2001, why did it take so long? Well, that was due to two main issues. Kubrick felt that essentially the 70s and 80s technology wasn't advanced enough to accurately represent artificial intelligence characters, so the movie lingered in pre-production for more than a decade until Kubrick lost the rights to the story. In 1983, however, Kubrick acquired them again, and in 1985, he encouraged Steven Spielberg to direct the movie while he produced it, as he also felt that the materials of the movie were much more closer to Spielberg's style rather than his own. And the pre-production of this movie in itself was extremely complex, with a number of writers being employed and fired after their writing efforts not meeting Kubrick's expectations, including Aldis himself, who ended up in really bad terms with Kubrick, which seems to be a really common theme in his career. Stephen King and The Shining. let's not forget that one. Nevertheless, Kubrick, who we can say took a long hiatus from AI to pursue the Aryan Papers, returned to the project with the release of Jurassic Park. And that was because this movie showed Kubrick that the result of CGI and animatronics could be quite realistic. So he decided to return working in the movie, resulting in the project being greenlit for production in 1994. So the movie's production continued, and here comes the second element, because Kubrick actually ironically believed that no child actor could convincingly play a robot like David, so much so that he went as far as supervising the building of a few child-sized robots with rubber-like faces to see if they would work, and spoiler alert, it didn't. In March 1999, following his unfortunate death, Spielberg received a phone call from his widow asking Spielberg to direct the movie, and AI was ultimately released in 2001, and it was dedicated to the memory and legacy of Stanley Kubrick.